Rome in the year 38 AD didn't gleam with marble virtue. It rotted from the inside out, and at the very heart of that rot sat a girl who would make emperors seem tame by comparison. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and when she married Emperor Claudius at 15 years old, Rome had no idea what was coming. They thought they were getting an empress. What they got was something history would spend 2,000 years trying to explain away. She wasn't supposed to matter. That's what makes this story so dangerous. Messalina was a pawn in the political marriages that held the Roman Empire together, a teenage bride given to a man 30 years her senior, a stammering, limping scholar whom nobody had expected to become emperor. Claudius was the family embarrassment, the one they kept in the libraries while the real men wore purple and conquered provinces. But when Caligula was assassinated and the Praetorian Guard needed someone, anyone, to legitimize their coup, they found Claudius hiding behind a curtain and made him emperor. And just like that, the girl became an empress. The historical record tries to be polite about what happened next. The chroniclers, men like Tacitus and Suetonius and Cassius Dio, write about her with the kind of disgusted fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. They call her shameless, insatiable, a nymphomaniac whose appetites destroyed everything they touched. They describe her crimes in language so vivid it still shocks readers 2 millennia later. But what they never quite capture is why. Why would a woman with unlimited power, unlimited wealth, unlimited access to anything Rome could offer, risk it all for the thing she did? If you've ever wondered what really happened behind the palace walls in ancient Rome, what the sanitized history books won't tell you, then stay with this. Because Messalina's story isn't just about sex or scandal. It's about power and what it does to people who are given too much of it too young. And if this grips you the way it should, if you want to know the details they usually leave out, then subscribe. Because there are more stories like this buried in ancient sources, and we're going to dig them all up. Now back to the girl who would become Rome's nightmare. Messalina was beautiful. Every source agrees on that, even the ones who hated her. She had the classical Roman features that sculptors loved, the kind of face that belonged on coins and statues. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes that ancient writers described as calculating even when she smiled. But beauty in Rome was currency, not character. And Messalina understood this earlier than most. She had been raised in the imperial family, close enough to power to see how it worked, but far enough removed to watch what it did to people. Her marriage to Claudius was arranged like all aristocratic marriages in Rome, a political alliance between powerful families. On their wedding night she was 15 and terrified. He was 45 and probably just as frightened. A man who had spent his entire life being mocked by his own family for his disabilities, suddenly thrust into marriage with a girl who represented everything he wasn't. Young, beautiful, physically perfect, connected to the Julian bloodline that gave her a prestige he could never claim. The ancient sources don't tell us what happened that first night, but they tell us what happened after. Within a year, Messalina had given Claudius 2 children, a daughter named Octavia and a son named Britannicus. She had fulfilled her primary duty as a Roman wife, securing the succession, giving the emperor heirs who could legitimize his unexpected reign. By every conventional measure, she should have been satisfied. She had done what was expected. She had power through her husband and security through her children. But Messalina wasn't interested in conventional measures. The first rumours started quietly, the way rumours always do in places where too many people have too much time and too little purpose. Servants whispered to other servants. guards mentioned things they had seen to their friends. Minor officials noted irregular comings and goings from the Empress's private quarters at unusual hours. At first it was just gossip, the kind that swirls around any powerful woman in any era. She's too friendly with that senator. She smiled too warmly at that actor. She spends too much time away from her husband. Claudius, absorbed in his histories and his administrative reforms, probably heard the whispers and dismissed them. He was a scholar who had never expected to rule, and he approached empire the way he approached everything else, through careful research and precedent. He was reorganizing the bureaucracy, annexing Britain, building aqueducts and harbours. He didn't have time for gossip about his young wife. And besides, he loved her. The sources suggest genuine affection on his part. A middle-aged man grateful to have a beautiful young woman in his bed. A woman who had given him children and seemed content with their arrangement. He was catastrophically wrong. Messalina had discovered something about herself, something that the conventional role of Roman Empress could not satisfy. Power, the real kind, the kind that came from controlling men who thought they were using her. This was what she craved, and sex was the tool through which that power flowed. In a society where women had almost no official authority, where they could not vote or hold office or command armies, Messalina found that her body was a weapon more effective than any legion. The first affairs were probably political. Roman aristocratic women often had lovers. It was an open secret, tolerated as long as it remained discreet. But Messalina's choices were strategic. She targeted men with influence, with connections, with resources she could manipulate. A senator here, a wealthy merchant there, a military commander with loyal troops. She collected them like tokens in Omikimauhana, a game only she fully understood. But then something shifted. The political calculation became something darker, more compulsive. The ancient historians describe it as madness, as an insatiable lust that no amount of satisfaction could quench. Suetonius writes that she competed with a famous prostitute to see who could service more men in a single night, and that Messalina won, exhausting 25 men before dawn, while the prostitute gave up at 21. Tacitus describes her sneaking out of the palace at night, disguising herself to visit brothels in the worst parts of Rome, taking clients for money she didn't need, risking discovery for the thrill of degradation. These stories sound like pornographic fantasy, and many modern historians dismiss them as exactly that. Propaganda written by men who needed to justify the eventual destruction of a woman who had threatened the masculine order of Roman politics. There's probably truth to that skepticism. Ancient sources exaggerated, editorialized, invented details to make moral points. We should be careful about accepting their accounts at face value. But here's what we know for certain. Documented in multiple independent sources, verified through cross-reference and archaeological evidence, Messalina wielded sexual power to accumulate political power, and she did it so effectively that she nearly overthrew the emperor himself. The details might be exaggerated. The compulsive promiscuity might be invention. But the core of the story, the danger she represented to the established order, that part is undeniably real. She began using her influence over Claudius to destroy her enemies. If someone opposed her, if someone questioned her behaviour, if someone simply possessed something she wanted, she would whisper the right accusations in the emperor's ear. Treason, conspiracy, plotting against the throne. Claudius, who loved her and trusted her, would sign the execution orders without investigating too carefully. Men who had served Rome for decades found themselves suddenly arrested, their property confiscated, their families exiled or killed. Messalina accumulated vast wealth this way, seizing estates from condemned aristocrats, forcing widows to sell their holdings for fractions of their value, using imperial authority to enrich herself beyond even the standard corruption of Roman politics. She bought loyalty from senators and generals, creating a network of supporters who depended on her continued favour for their own survival. Within a few years of becoming empress, she had built a power structure that existed parallel to, and sometimes in opposition to, the emperor's own authority, and she was barely 20 years old. The palace itself became a theatre of her ambitions. She surrounded herself with supporters, with freedmen and slaves who owed everything to her patronage, who carried her messages and executed her orders and kept her secrets. She controlled access to Claudius, determining who could see the emperor and when, shaping the information that reached him, filtering reality through her own agenda. In a very real sense, she was ruling Rome while Claudius thought he was. The ancient sources paint her as purely evil, a monster of sexuality and greed. But there's another way to read this story. Here was a teenage girl, married off to a man she didn't choose, expected to be grateful for a role that gave her no real agency, surrounded by men who wielded absolute power, while she was supposed to smile and produce heirs and stay silent. Is it any wonder she found ways to seize power for herself? Is it surprising that in a system designed to keep her powerless, she used the only weapons available to her? That doesn't excuse what came next. Nothing excuses what came next. Because Messalina's ambitions didn't stop at wealth or influence or even at effective control of the empire. She wanted something more, something so audacious that when the ancient historians describe it, you can still hear their shock echoing across 2,000 years. She wanted to replace Claudius entirely. She wanted to put her own choice on the throne, a man she had selected, a man she controlled completely. And she was willing to commit the one crime that Rome could absolutely not forgive to make it happen. She was going to marry someone else while still married to the emperor. His name was Gaius Silius, and by all accounts he was exactly what Messalina wanted. Young, beautiful, ambitious, and just reckless enough to believe he could survive what she was planning. He came from a good family, but not good enough to threaten the established order on his own. He had been consul, one of Rome's highest offices, which gave him prestige and connections. But most importantly, he was completely besotted with the empress, willing to do anything she asked, unable to see the precipice she was leading him toward. The affair between Messalina and Silius wasn't secret. Not really. By 48 AD, after 10 years of marriage to Claudius, Messalina had stopped pretending to be discreet. She appeared with Silius in public. She gave him gifts that everyone recognized as coming from the imperial treasury. She visited his house openly, sometimes staying overnight, returning to the palace at dawn, with her attendants exchanging knowing glances. The whole city knew. Senators whispered about it in the forum. Merchants joked about it in the markets. Common people made crude songs about the empress and her lover. But knowing and acknowledging are different things in Rome. As long as nobody forced the issue, as long as Messalina maintained the technical fiction of propriety, the system could absorb even this scandal. Roman aristocrats had been conducting affairs for centuries. Emperors kept mistresses. Empresses took lovers. The machinery of power could accommodate human weakness as long as the forms were observed, as long as nobody pushed too far. Messalina was about to push as far as anyone could, possibly go. According to Tacitus, it started as a conversation between the lovers. Silius was getting nervous, The affair had become too public, too obvious. Sooner or later, someone would force Claudius to acknowledge what everyone already knew, and when that happened, both of them would die. Messalina had protected them so far through her influence over the emperor, but that protection couldn't last forever. They needed a permanent solution. What Messalina proposed was either brilliant or insane, depending on how you looked at it. They would marry. Officially, publicly, ceremonially. They would hold a wedding with all the traditional Roman rites, witnessed by senators and officials, legally binding under Roman law. And here was the truly mad part. They would do it while Claudius was out of the city, before he could stop them. Once they were married, once the deed was done, and witnessed by enough powerful people, they could claim that Messalina's marriage to Claudius had been invalid for technical reasons. Silius would become the empress's legitimate husband, stepfather to the imperial children, and with Messalina's network of supporters, they could force Claudius to accept the situation or face a civil war he would probably lose. It was a coup disguised as a wedding, a revolution hidden inside a ceremony. And Silius, drunk on lust and ambition, and the intoxicating proximity to absolute power, agreed. The ancient historians describe what happened next with a mixture of horror and fascination. In the autumn of 48 AD, while Claudius was away at Ostia inspecting the new harbour construction, Messalina and Silius held their wedding. Not a quiet ceremony in some hidden location, but a full traditional Roman marriage, conducted in Silius's gardens, attended by hundreds of guests. There were priests to perform the sacred rites. There were witnesses from the most prominent families in Rome. There was a feast with music and dancers and wine flowing like water. And at the centre of it all, Messalina, dressed in the traditional bridal veil, pledging herself to a man who was not the emperor. Try to understand how insane this was. This wasn't just adultery. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a direct assault on the fundamental structures of Roman power. The emperor's wife, the mother of the heir to the throne, publicly marrying another man while the emperor still lived. It was treason and sacrilege and revolution all happening simultaneously, wrapped in the sacred forms of Roman marriage. Some of the guests apparently thought it was a joke, an elaborate theatrical performance, the kind of decadent entertainment that imperial Rome was famous for. They laughed and drank and participated because they assumed it couldn't possibly be real. Nobody, not even Messalina, would be crazy enough to actually marry someone else while married to the emperor. It had to be satire, political theatre, a commentary on something. But Messalina was deadly serious. She went through every traditional element of the ceremony. She took the vows, she performed the sacrifices. She allowed herself to be led to Silius's bedchamber, as custom demanded, consummating the marriage in front of witnesses who were required by tradition to verify that the union had been completed. By every legal and religious standard Rome recognised, she was now married to Gaius Silius. Word reached Claudius the next day. His freedmen, the bureaucrats who actually ran the empire while the emperor dabbled in scholarship, sent urgent messages to Ostia. The empress has married another man. She's claiming you're no longer her legitimate husband. She's moving to secure the succession through Silius. Half the Senate is at her wedding feast. You need to return to Rome immediately. Claudius, according to the sources, didn't believe it at first. It was too absurd, too impossible. Messalina was his wife, the mother of his children. She might have lovers, he might have heard those rumours and chosen to ignore them, but she wouldn't marry someone else. She wouldn't commit political suicide so publicly and thoroughly. His advisors had to be exaggerating, misunderstanding, panicking over nothing. But they convinced him to return to Rome, to see for himself, to confront what was actually happening in his own palace while he'd been gone for 3 days inspecting harbour construction. The journey back to the city must have been surreal for Claudius. He was Emperor of Rome, commander of legions that stretched from Britain to Egypt, the most powerful man in the known world, and he was rushing back to his capital because his wife had married someone else and nobody seemed to know if he was still emperor or not. The constitutional crisis was unprecedented. Roman law had no mechanism for handling this situation. What happened when an empress married someone other than the emperor? Who had legitimate authority? If Messalina's marriage to Silius was legally valid, did that make her children with Claudius illegitimate? Did the succession pass through Silius now? These questions weren't academic. They would be settled by force, by whoever could mobilize the most supporters, by whoever the Praetorian Guard decided to back. And right now, that wasn't clear. Messalina had spent years cultivating loyalty among the guard officers. She had supporters throughout the military and the Senate. If it came to armed conflict, Claudius might actually lose. When the emperor's carriage entered Rome, the city was in chaos. Messalina's wedding celebration was still going on, now in its second day, a bacchanal that had spread through multiple aristocratic houses. Drunk senators stumbled through the streets. Musicians played on corners. The whole thing had the atmosphere of a festival, except what was being celebrated was the potential overthrow of the government. Claudius went first to the Praetorian barracks. He needed to know if the guard would support him or if they'd already decided that Silius and Messalina represented the future. He stood before his soldiers, this stammering, limping scholar who had never wanted to be emperor, and asked for their loyalty. The scene must have been pathetic and powerful at the same time. Here was the Emperor of Rome, begging his own troops not to abandon him for his wife and her lover. The Praetorian prefect, a freedman named Narcissus, who had his own reasons to hate Messalina, assured Claudius that the guard remained loyal. But he also gave the emperor advice that would determine what happened next. You cannot hesitate. You cannot try to negotiate. You cannot show weakness. Messalina is counting on your affection for her to protect her. If you give her a chance to see you, to speak to you, to remind you of your children together, she will talk you out of doing what needs to be done. You have to act now, decisively, before she can mount a defence. Claudius, still in shock, still trying to process that his wife had actually married another man in front of hundreds of witnesses, gave the order. Arrest them, arrest everyone involved, and bring me proof when it's done. Messalina heard the soldiers coming. She was in the gardens of Lucullus, a vast estate she had seized from a condemned aristocrat years earlier, when word reached her that the emperor had returned and issued arrest orders. For the first time in her adult life, she felt real fear. Not the anxiety of possibly being caught in an affair, but the cold certainty that she had finally pushed too far. The game was over, and she had lost. Her supporters fled immediately. The senators who had attended her wedding suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The officers who had promised to back her coup discovered that loyalty to the emperor was more important than loyalty to his wife. Within hours, Messalina went from having half of Rome in her pocket to having nobody willing to stand beside her. She tried to reach Claudius. If she could just see him, just speak to him, she could make him understand. She could explain. She could remind him of their children, of their years together, of everything they had built. She could use every weapon in her arsenal. Tears, accusations, appeals to his vanity, and his loneliness and his fear of being alone again. She had manipulated him successfully for 10 years. One more conversation, and she could do it again. But Narcissus and the other freedmen who now controlled access to the emperor, made sure that conversation never happened. They intercepted her messengers. They blocked the routes to the palace. They surrounded Claudius with advisors who reinforced his anger and his humiliation, who reminded him that the entire city was laughing at him, that his authority was destroyed unless he responded with overwhelming force. Messalina made one final attempt. She took her children, little Britannicus and Octavia, and tried to bring them to their father. Surely Claudius wouldn't order her execution in front of their own children. Surely seeing Britannicus, his son and heir, would remind the emperor of everything he stood to lose if he destroyed their family publicly. The soldiers stopped her before she reached the palace. They separated her from the children. They confined her to the gardens of Lucullus while the emperor decided her fate. Meanwhile, Silius was already dead. The soldiers had found him at his house, still drunk from the wedding celebration, unable to quite believe that his marriage to the empress wasn't going to result in him becoming emperor. They executed him in his own atrium, quickly and efficiently, before he could mount any kind of defence or rally any supporters. His head was brought to Claudius as proof. The emperor stared at the severed head of the man who had married his wife. According to Tacitus, Claudius said nothing. He simply nodded, confirming that he recognized Silius, confirming the execution had been carried out properly. Then he asked about Messalina. The soldiers found her in the gardens of Lucullus, surrounded by the statues and fountains she had stolen from the families she destroyed. She wasn't dressed as an empress anymore. The wedding finery was gone, replaced by simple mourning clothes, a calculated choice designed to appear humble and penitent when she finally got her audience with Claudius. She had her mother with her, Domitia Lepida, one of the few people who hadn't abandoned her when the soldiers came. The two women were preparing a speech, rehearsing the words Messalina would use to save her life. But the tribune who commanded the execution squad had strict orders from Narcissus. Do not let her speak. Do not let her explain. Do not bring her before the emperor. Just finish it. Messalina saw the soldiers approaching and understood immediately what their presence meant. There would be no trial, no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to use the skills that had kept her alive and powerful for a decade. The game had rules, and she had broken the only one that mattered. You could commit adultery, you could murder your enemies, you could steal and scheme and corrupt. But you could not publicly humiliate the emperor. You couldn't make him look weak in front of the entire city. That was the unforgivable crime, and the punishment was always the same. According to Tacitus, she tried to kill herself. She grabbed a dagger from one of her attendants and pressed it to her throat, but her hands were shaking too badly to complete the act. Her mother tried to help her, tried to guide the blade, but Messalina couldn't do it. After years of fearlessly destroying others, she couldn't find the courage to destroy herself. The tribune didn't wait. He drove his sword through her chest while she knelt in the garden she had claimed through murder. She died instantly, her blood soaking into expensive marble she would never enjoy again. She was 22 years old. Her body was left where it fell. No funeral, no ceremony, no mourning period. The woman who'd been Empress of Rome for 10 years was treated like a criminal, her corpse abandoned in a garden, while the city pretended she had never existed. Claudius was informed of her death while he was at dinner. He was already drunk, surrounded by advisors who had spent the afternoon reinforcing his anger and his sense of betrayal. When they told him Messalina was dead, he reportedly asked for more wine and changed the subject. He never mentioned her name again in any recorded conversation. The erasure was systematic and thorough. Messalina's images were removed from coins and statues. Her name was chiselled off monuments. Documents were altered to remove references to her. the Senate passed a formal damnatio memoriae, condemning her memory, attempting to delete her from history as if she had never been born. Every person who had supported her, who had attended her wedding to Silius, who had benefited from her patronage, now competed to denounce her most vigorously. Senators who had laughed at her parties now gave speeches about her depravity. Officers who had accepted her bribes now swore they had always been loyal to Claudius alone. The official story became fixed within weeks. Messalina was insane, a nymphomaniac whose uncontrollable lusts had driven her to treason, a monster of sexuality who had corrupted everyone around her. She had no political goals, no rational motivations. She was simply evil, a cautionary tale about what happened when women were given power they couldn't handle. This narrative served everyone's interests. It excused the men who had enabled her by portraying them as victims of her supernatural sexual power. It restored Claudius's dignity by suggesting he had been bewitched rather than simply cuckolded. And it reinforced the fundamental lesson Rome needed to teach. Women who stepped outside their assigned roles would be destroyed and forgotten. But here's what the official story leaves out. Messalina almost won. If Claudius had stayed in Ostia one more day, if she had been allowed to speak to him directly, if even a few more senators had decided to back her coup, Roman history might have taken a completely different path. She came within hours of successfully replacing the emperor with her own choice, of establishing a precedent where imperial power could pass through women rather than just through men. The system destroyed her not because she was incompetent or crazy, but because she was terrifyingly effective. Think about what she accomplished in just 10 years. She accumulated massive personal wealth through confiscations and extortion. She built a network of supporters throughout the Senate, the military, and the bureaucracy. She controlled access to the emperor, effectively ruling the empire while Claudius focused on his historical research. She identified the one structural weakness in the Roman political system, the fact that emperors derived their legitimacy partly through their wives and families, and she exploited that weakness to nearly overthrow the government. She was 22 when she died, and she had held the most powerful empire in the world in her hands. The ancient historians want us to believe her downfall came from sexual excess, from appetites she couldn't control. But that's not what the evidence actually shows. Messalina's mistake wasn't sleeping with too many men. Her mistake was being too public about her coup attempt. If she had married Silius quietly, if she had waited until she had secured more military support, if she had moved against Claudius with more preparation and less theatrical flourish, she might have succeeded. Her failure was tactical, not moral. And what about the sexual accusations? The stories about competing with prostitutes, about sneaking out to brothels, about servicing 25 men in a single night. Modern historians have spent considerable energy trying to determine how much of this is true and how much is propaganda. The consensus now is that most of it was probably invented or exaggerated by sources who needed to justify her execution. Roman women, especially aristocratic women, were routinely slandered through sexual accusations. It was the standard way to destroy a woman's reputation when you couldn't attack her political positions directly. But here's the uncomfortable part. Some of it might be true. Not because Messalina was insane or hypersexual, but because she understood something profound about power. In a society that denied women almost all official authority, sex was one of the few areas where they could exercise genuine control. Through sexual relationships, they could influence powerful men, could create obligations and debts, could build networks that existed outside the formal structures of Roman politics. Messalina might have used sex compulsively, not because she was addicted to pleasure, but because she was addicted to power, and sex was the most effective tool available to her. That doesn't make her a victim. She destroyed countless lives in her pursuit of power. The men she had executed, the families she had ruined, the people who died because she wanted their property or their positions, these victims deserve to be remembered too. Messalina was not a feminist hero fighting patriarchy. She was a ruthless political operator who used every weapon at her disposal to accumulate power, and she didn't care who suffered in the process. But she also wasn't the sex-crazed monster the ancient sources describe. She was a young woman placed in an impossible situation, married at 15 to a man she didn't choose, expected to be grateful for a role that gave her all the responsibility of power with none of the authority. She found ways to seize real power in a system designed to keep her decorative and powerless. And when the system finally destroyed her, it had to work very hard to erase the evidence of how close she had come to winning. Claudius remarried within months of Messalina's death. His new wife was his niece, Agrippina the Younger, another ambitious woman from the imperial family. Agrippina learned from Messalina's mistakes. She was more subtle, more patient, more willing to work within the system, rather than trying to overthrow it openly. She maneuvered her son Nero into position as Claudius's heir, then probably poisoned the emperor when he threatened to change his mind. She succeeded where Messalina failed, placing her own choice on the throne and ruling through him for years. The difference between them wasn't morality. Both women were willing to kill for power. Both used their sexuality as a political tool. Both manipulated elderly emperors for their own purposes. The difference was style. Agrippina understood that Rome would tolerate almost anything as long as you maintained the fiction of propriety. Messalina's public wedding to Silius shattered that fiction, forced everyone to acknowledge what was happening, and once the crime was undeniable, the punishment had to be severe. What happened to Messalina's children tells you everything you need to know about how Rome processed this scandal. Britannicus, her son with Claudius, was sidelined in favour of Nero and eventually poisoned when he came of age and might have challenged the new emperor. Octavia, her daughter, was married to Nero in a political arrangement, then divorced on false adultery charges and executed when she became inconvenient. Both of Messalina's children were destroyed by the same political machinery their mother had tried to control. The bloodline she had schemed to protect was wiped out within 15 years of her death. The sources that preserve Messalina's story were all written by men, decades after her death, with clear political and moral agendas. They needed her to be a monster to justify her execution and to discourage other women from attempting what she attempted. They needed her to be crazy to explain how she could threaten a natural order where men ruled and women obeyed. They needed her to be purely sexual, because that was the only kind of female power they could conceptualize and condemn. But if you read those sources carefully, if you look past the moral condemnation and the sexual hysteria, you see something else. You see a brilliant political operator who understood power better than most of the men around her. You see someone who identified systemic weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. You see a woman who nearly became the first female ruler of Rome, not through inheritance or marriage, but through her own strategic genius. She failed. The system destroyed her, and then spent 2,000 years lying about why. But for 10 years, Messalina held the Roman Empire in her hands, and every emperor who came after had to reckon with what she had almost accomplished. They changed the rules because of her. They limited what empresses could do, who they could see, how much independent wealth they could accumulate. They built new constraints into the system specifically to prevent another Messalina. That's not the biography of a sex addict. That's the biography of someone who terrified the most powerful empire in history. If this story affected you, if you saw past the scandal to the political genius underneath, if you understand why they had to lie about her for 2,000 years, then leave a comment. Tell us what you think really happened. Tell us whether Messalina was monster or visionary, or both. And if you want more stories like this, more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world, then subscribe. Because Rome is full of women like Messalina. Women who were erased or slandered or simplified into cautionary tales. And we're going to tell all their stories, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. Some voices demand to be heard, even across 2 millennia of silence. Messalina's is one of them.